Thank you very much, Victor, for your words of welcome. We appreciate your hospitality, and we appreciate your leadership in making it possible for us to carry out this work. We're here in good measure as a consequence of a decision taken by the United States government on October 17, announced this year, to pause in the funding of research for gain-of-function research related to influenza, SARS, and MERS, influenza viruses and coronaviruses. Some have asked, what changed in the background and concerns about gain-of-function research to prompt that decision? In effect, the discussions about gain-of-function, or as sometimes has been called dual-use research, has been an active engagement in at least parts of the scientific community for a number of years. In 2012, the United States government announced, after other pauses voluntarily undertaken by scientists, a policy about gain-of-function research that implied the research would go forward under certain specified conditions. It identified 15 agents or toxins which could be of concern, and it identified 7 classes of research that could be of concern. What happened between 2012 and October of 2014 were a set of incidents in June reported of this year where there were mishaps, not having to do with gain-of-function research, but in procedures and practices in labs. The Centers for Disease Control inadvertently allowed anthrax to be exposed to a number of employees. Another lab at the Centers for Disease Control inadvertently sent a more dangerous virus than intended to a laboratory at the Department of Agriculture, fortunately also a BL3 laboratory. And it was discovered in an abandoned lab that someone had neglected to notice that stores of smallpox virus had been kept for years unattended, unnoticed, and unaware. These episodes alerted a number of people to the possibility, maybe even the likelihood, of mishaps of one kind and another related to research, and that refocused attention on the possibilities of similar errors related to gain-of-function research and the viruses that would be involved in that research. And that in turn led the Office of Science and Technology Policy and the agencies of government to announce that it was pausing in the funding of this research, and it was asking the NSABB to undertake a more systematic, reflective assessment than it had perhaps in the past. And it invited the National Academies to assist the NSABB by convening this workshop and a subsequent meeting that will be held after the NSABB has drafted its preliminary findings in order to have a wider consideration of their implications and final conclusions. So we gathered here today are part of a process that has been launched since October, intended to provide a more fundamental reflection, reconsideration, and direction for the future of gain-of-function research sponsored by the United States government. We are not here to reach a consensus on what should be done. That is not our purpose in a day and a half. We're not here even to force agreement on any particular topics or issues that relate to one or another of the benefits and risks. Rather, our purpose in this day and a half is to do our best to systematically expose, explain, and identify those elements of consideration that should be brought to bear on the question of proceeding or not proceeding with what types of gain-of-function research. We know from what has happened over the recent years and what is present in the literature that there are widely divergent viewpoints amongst experts of all kinds, those who deal directly with influenza and related viruses, those who deal with coronavirus, those who deal with the epidemiology and surveillance, those who are responsible for protecting the public health, those whose perspective is based on their responsibility for security, those who create and use vaccines. All of these perspectives and more, especially the perspective of the public, are points of view that we hope at least to be able to expose and to identify in the course of these days. We will have done our job in this next 36 hours if by the end of our conversation we have been able to enumerate in a more systematic way what are the questions, where are the points of potential agreement, where are the points of difference, what differences would matter most to the ultimate decisions that will need to be made. In its announcement of the funding pause, the government also said that it would commission a benefit risk analysis to be carried out in the course of the deliberations of the NSABB to help inform and to give a more complete and coherent analysis for the benefit of that body. Our job is, in the course of this day and a half, to help identify those elements that should be part of a benefit risk analysis, those elements that will matter, those elements that may require a lot more investigation and inquiry in order to assess properly. We're going to be hearing in the course of this day and a half from many different points of view. That's our purpose. We want to expose all responsible points of view on this topic. We're going to have an opportunity, particularly tomorrow morning, for wider discussion about what we have missed, what's most important in what we have said, in order to try to capture that as well. We will encourage individuals, as time permits in the discussion periods for each of the topics, to raise points of question, points of observation, points that are relevant to the larger set of questions. I personally want to say at the outset how grateful I am to each member of the Planning Committee who worked so diligently to help us in preparing, inviting, and organizing these sessions. And I want to express my thanks especially to our staff, who did so much along the way to enable us to get this group organized and brought together in a remarkably short space of time. We are not the only ones who are trying to come to grips with the questions on gain-of-function research. Literally just last week, and I know many of you here were in fact in attendance, a meeting was held in Hanover, organized by the Volkswagen Foundation, bringing together investigators, scientists, scholars from virology, from biosafety, from biosecurity points of view, to discuss some of the same kinds of questions that we're going to be considering in this day and a half. One of the key lessons, I believe, from the fact of that meeting, as well as the content of the meeting, is that the topics we are considering are global concerns. They are not restricted to the interests the programs or the funding of any one nation. Science is universal, and the possibilities of both the benefit and risk from the class of research of gain of function is not limited to any one country. So one of the backdrop considerations that will underlie our discussions and what emerges from these discussions will necessarily be how the world can proceed to develop a consensus about a way forward. It will not be easy because the mechanisms are not automatically in evidence. However, absent ultimately a global reconciliation on a strategy, we are likely to have suboptimal arrangements in one or more other parts of the globe. It will be hard enough to have agreed upon protocols, standards, and procedures, and it will be even harder to have them enforced should we be able to reach them. But a great lesson from the fact of the global discussion is that this is not a national problem alone. It is a global problem. The discussion in Hanover was wide-ranging and covered many of the topics of benefit and risk that we're going to be enumerating and elaborating upon in the course of this day and a half. One of the important aspects of this meeting that I think is different to what was discussed in Hanover is that because the pause applies to influenza and SARS and MERS, namely to coronaviruses as well as influenza viruses, it's going to be very important for us to develop a virological understanding that looks at the similarities and distinctions amongst different classes of virus in the same way that we think about the distinctions among different classes of gain of function research. Gain of function, of course, means many different things. You cannot create a vaccine without selecting for viruses that grow well in the medium and mechanism that you use to produce the vaccine. So gain of function of reproducibility is something that we have done with influenza, for example, for decades. The concerns are not about gain of function generically, they're about particular types of gain of function work. There's a symmetry that we will hear in the course of our discussion in the way in which proponents and critics of research talk about benefits and risks. And I hope that we'll be attuned in the course of our listening over this day and a half to always understand exactly what benefit are we talking about of doing what relative to doing what else. Every benefit and every risk is always relative to an alternative. The alternative of not doing, or the alternative of doing, or the alternative of doing one thing versus doing another thing. And the benefits in going from A to B are exactly symmetrical to the risks of going from B to A. The terminology we use and the ways in which we'll be thinking about it in the course of these days, I hope, will help to clarify and not to further obscure the important considerations. Benefits and risks are not psychologically identical. And we will have an opportunity in the course of this day and a half to think about the consequences of doing or not doing research, both in terms of benefits and in terms of risk. One other feature that I think personally is quite important is where does the burden of proof rest for movement from one to another choice? When the original debate occurred about publication of the research on gain of function with avian influenza to make it transmissible among ferrets. The burden of proof was clearly on the NSABB to decide whether it felt there was sufficient concern to inhibit or limit or restrict or in any way modify publication of those findings. With the advance of a pause, the burden is shifted more emphatically even than in the 2012 guidance toward those who would proceed with research to demonstrate that the safety is such and the potential benefits are such that the research is in fact worthwhile. And this was a point that also came out in the course of the discussions in Hanover. Another very important insight that was developed at that meeting was the fact that when we talk about laboratory safety, that the traditional classifications of BL3 and BL4 or BL2, the traditional classifications of biohazard, are not sufficiently informative or specific to give us the assurance that we would like about the functions and the security of any one laboratory. And the fact of the matter is that a label like BL3 covers a wide variety of laboratory procedures and practices. And the difference is not simply understanding purpose-built laboratories as opposed to generically functioning labs, but to think about biosafety in terms of whole systems of construction, of operation, of training, of protocols, of measures and monitoring that creates a degree of safety in the functioning laboratory for a particular purpose. And finally, I would say from my vantage point, a reinforcement that I came away from this meeting was in answer to a question: how do we actually make progress in our thinking collectively about this very vexing and challenging problem? We've been debating in some quarters for several years. I can tell you that at least some of the scientists who are involved and have been involved feel like they're treading water, a little bit like they're in the movie Groundhog Day. Every day they wake up and have to relive and rehearse and revisit the same arguments and the same discussion and the same debates, sometimes with the same people and sometimes with a slightly widened audience. My hope is that by attempting to put forward a framework for analysis that not only identifies the arguments in generic terms and the directions of those arguments, but helps to quantify the degrees of expectation and the degrees of understanding and the relative risks and benefits, can help us move beyond a word debate that can only take us so far. So if we are successful in identifying these issues, I believe that we will have done a great deal in the course of this discussion to help advance the debate, help advance understanding, and help identify exactly what are the critical points of difference that will make a difference in the choice of how we go forward. So I want to thank all of you who are here. I want to anticipate and thank those particularly who have agreed to offer their insights in the presentations, but I look forward even more to hearing from and to learning from the reactions, reflections, and ideas that each of you will bring to the topic. At this point, I have the pleasure of welcoming Andrew Hebbeler, who is the Assistant Director for Biological and Chemical Threats at the Office of Science and Technology Policy, who will help provide an overview on policy for gain-of-function proposals and a charge to the academies in our process working forward. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Dr. Feinberg, and thank you to the committee for inviting me to speak here today. We come together to discuss a very important issue, gain-of-function research and how we can work together in partnership with the life sciences community to establish a framework that will guide future federal investments in this area of research. What I hope to do today is just take a few minutes to tell you from the government's perspective sort of the context that led to the announcement in October of the deliberative process that we are a part of today. But I wanted to start, well, first by understanding how to progress the slides. Sure. By asking sort of a broad overarching question. So as Dr. Feinberg mentioned, I work in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and directly support John Holdren, who is both President Obama's Science and Technology Advisor, as well as the Director of Office in Science and Technology Policy. In Dr. Holdren's role as Director of OSTP, he has oversight of S&T priorities and the federal S&T enterprise. And my role in the Office of Science and Technology Policy is really focusing on biological threats. And the approach that this administration has taken to biological threats from a security perspective isn't just limited to bioterrorism. It really is the spectrum of risk, from natural outbreaks of infectious disease on one side of the spectrum, through laboratory accidents, to deliberate acts of bioterrorism. So really the question is, how can we reliably identify and, where necessary, mitigate risks along that biological risk spectrum while also protecting scientific autonomy, discovery and innovation, public health, national security, and other critical interests? Gain-of-function studies, whether it's the appropriate term or not for the set of discussions in the area that we are going to discuss here today, represents one set of risks on that safety and security continuum. So I would encourage you, as you approach these deliberations, to really remember that or think of this question in that broader overarching context. What led to the announcement in October really was a series of incidents that all of you in this room are familiar with, of laboratory incidents that occurred essentially in June and July of this year. Now, I list a series of dates here, and these are generally when management became aware of these instances, but aren't necessarily reflective of when the incidents themselves happened. And of course, these three incidents through June and July are not the only laboratory incidents that have ever happened. It was really the clustering of three in such a short period of time at some of our premier biomedical research institutions that really caused us to reassess the safety and security that underlies the decisions that guide some of our investments in gain-of-function studies. As all of you know, in June, the CDC revealed the exposure of several CDC employees to potentially live anthrax. That was followed fairly quickly in July with the discovery of previously unknown smallpox vials at FDA on the NIH campus. And then later in July, we learned of the contamination by CDC of low pathogenic strain of influenza with a high pathogenic strain of influenza. And these incidents led to a very focused lines of response that happened both at the department level as well as at the White House level. At the department level, there were several reviews or investigations to identify causes and contributing factors. These led to reports which have been publicly distributed, which both lay out causes and contributing factors as well as specific responses that the department or departments had taken. There were also a coordinated set of activities that originated by departments and agencies that aimed at strengthening pathogen control and handling, biosafety, and laboratory biosecurity. At the White House level, there was an interest both from John Holdren, my boss, as well as Lisa Monaco, the Assistant to the President for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, to really urge departments and agencies to take a coordinated set of actions with the goal of improving overall safety and security. These actions that were requested by Dr. Holdren and Ms. Monaco were codified in a memorandum that was released to departments and agencies on August 18th, entitled Enhancing Biosafety and Biosecurity in the United States. And that memorandum really laid out a series of shorter-term and longer-term activities aimed at strengthening safety and security. Notably, one of the shorter-term activities that was called for was a safety stand-down. That was to happen within 30 days of release of the memorandum. That stand-down was completed, and the results, or an overview of the results, will be forthcoming shortly. And then finally, the Department of Health and Human Services asked the U.S. government in this context of the incidents to consider reevaluating the risk-benefit ratio for conducting gain-of-function studies. And as I've sort of mentioned already, the recent laboratory incidents prompted a reassessment of that risk-benefit calculus that underpins the funding for certain types of gain-of-function studies. The incidents, combined with a series of calls from multiple stakeholders within the life sciences community, also drove the effort to announce the launch of the deliberative process. All of you in this room are familiar with calls that have come from the Cambridge Working Group, from Scientists for Science, and there have also been a variety of other efforts, namely, most recently, the effort in Hanover, Germany, to discuss the risks and benefits associated with gain-of-function studies. In the U.S. government's own deliberations that preceded the announcement, the highest concern in the gain-of-function area was really for respiratory pathogens that possessed pandemic potential. These included MERS, SARS, as well as influenza. When we looked at the frameworks that exist for gain-of-function studies, there are some that address it directly and others that address it less directly. And what I summarize here are several policy frameworks that provide a basis for evaluating gain-of-function studies or decisions to fund gain-of-function research. The Department of Health and Human Services has a framework for highly pathogenic avian influenza research that really governs funding decisions for 2 specific strains of influenza. There are also now a suite or 2 federal policies that provide oversight for life sciences dual-use research of concern. This is a framework that includes both federal oversight as codified in a policy that was released in March 2012, as well as more recently a policy for institutional oversight of life sciences DIRC that was just released in September of 2014. And there also, of course, are the NIH guidelines for research involving recombinant or synthetic nucleic acid molecules. So I would encourage all of you, as we consider the risks and benefits and how to proceed in this area of research, to draw on the frameworks that are pre-existing to guide how we think about the future. These events led to the launch in October of the deliberative process. On October 17th, the U.S. government announced this process to assess the potential risks and benefits associated with gain-of-function studies. From our perspective within the government, the key feature of this announcement really was the deliberative process. And the research funding pause that all of you are aware of was really a way that we felt was a responsible act of government, that we felt a responsibility to pause certain types of higher risk studies while the community had a chance to deliberate on and assemble a framework that will guide these these types of investments going forward. And that research funding pause was for certain types of gain-of-function experiments involving influenza, SARS, and MERS. There are key voices that have been built into the U.S. government's gain-of-function deliberative process. These key voices include the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity, or the NSABB, as well as the National Academies. We, of course, are here today as part of the latter key voice. The NSABB, in the deliberative process, will draft a set of recommendations on a conceptual approach to the evaluation of proposed gain-of-function studies that will be reviewed by the broader life sciences community. And the NSABB will serve as the official federal advisory body for providing advice on oversight of this area of research to the Health and Human Services Secretary. The National Academies, on the other hand, was the mechanism to really engage broadly the life sciences community. And the academies in this deliberative process will convene two public conferences. This, of course, is the first of the two, to facilitate broad discussion of the issues associated with gain-of-function research. And the latter meeting will include a discussion of the NSABB draft recommendations. And really the goal of the academies and this process, or this part of the process, is to provide a summary of public discussions and feedback on the forthcoming NSABB draft recommendations. I lay out here our estimated timeline. We are committed to this process occurring as expeditiously as possible and have structured a process that should last a year. It was launched, of course, in late 2014 and has been structured to span into late 2015. The process involves four major components: study design, conduct of the study, results of the study, and at the conclusion, weighing of risks and benefits in developing recommendations. Along the top in gray, I lay out some key milestones in the NSABB part of the deliberative process. And along the bottom, you can see essentially the two major places where the National Academies will play an important role. One, in hosting this public discussion, and then later on, once the NSABB has drafted recommendations, pulling the life sciences community back together to discuss those draft recommendations and provide feedback to the NSABB. But ultimately, this process, those recommendations will be delivered to the government, and those recommendations will inform the development of a policy that will govern future federal investments in U.S. government gain-of-function research. And I lay out here just a series of links for some of the important documents that I've mentioned here. But on a final note, I just want to conclude by saying that the discussions that you're a part of today are really important and will play an important role in informing the policy that we ultimately develop within the government. And I encourage you to approach this discussion openly and use this opportunity to really identify, as Dr. Feinberg said earlier, those points where we have solid agreement, and more importantly, those parts where we have disagreement, so that we can focus our time and energy during this process really coming to consensus on how to approach those areas where we aren't necessarily in complete alignment. And with that, maybe I'll turn it over to Mary, who will say a few words and provide sort of the charge to the National Research Council.
Thank you very much. I did want to welcome Mary Groesch, who is the program advisor to biosecurity and biosafety policy at the NIH, and she has graciously agreed to be here to give us insight from the NIH perspective. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm filling in for Dr. Amy Patterson from the NIH, who sends her regrets that she wasn't able to be here. And as Dr. Feinberg mentioned, I'll just briefly go over the charge to the academies. You've heard some of these points by earlier speakers. But basically, we've asked the academies to provide a forum for broad public input, and this input will help in the deliberations of both the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity and the U.S. government as it develops new policy regarding gain-of-function research. We asked the academies to host 2 symposia. The first, which is this one, we asked that it be early in the deliberative process so that the key scientific and technical issues regarding gain-of-function research with pathogens with pandemic potential could be addressed in depth. And then the second symposium will occur much later in the deliberative process after the NSABB has had a chance to develop some draft recommendations. And we very much want those recommendations to benefit from broad public input. So we ask that there be a second symposium at that point. In terms of the goals of the symposium, what we really want to do is to bring to the table a diverse range of perspectives and expertise. And this is including but not limited to public health and public health surveillance, biosafety and biosecurity, infectious disease research, drug and vaccine development, and as has been mentioned, very important to have international perspectives in all of these areas. The deliverable from each of the symposiums will be a summary that highlights the key points that came up during the discussions, and these will be provided to both the NSABB and the U.S. government to help in their deliberations. So for today's symposium, we're very much looking forward to the discussions that will take place throughout today and part of tomorrow. As has been mentioned, one of the NSABB's first taskings, and you'll hear more about this in just a moment from Dr. Stanley, is to identify principles and key considerations for some risk and benefit assessments regarding gain-of-function research. And this will be greatly informed by the topics that will be discussed at today's and tomorrow's meeting. And the presentations and discussions that address the potential risks and benefits of gain-of-function research. And we're also very much in hearing people's thoughts about alternative ways of doing some of this research that may involve less risk. And all of these discussions will very much help in the design of the risk and benefit assessments. So again, I'd like to thank all of you, thank the academies for hosting these meetings and for your willingness to share your expertise and your thoughts with us. Everything we hear will be very carefully considered during the next few months of deliberations. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. It's now my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Samuel Stanley, who's the chair of the NSABB, to offer his perspective and particularly to review the discussions and insights gained from the meeting held on October 22nd. Dr. Stanley.
Well, thank you so much, Harvey, and I want to thank the National Academy as well for the opportunity to be part of these very important discussions about the risk and benefits associated with certain kinds of gain-of-function research. And Harvey, thank you so much for your really eloquent framing at the beginning of the issues that are before us today. So I am chair. I do have the privilege of chairing the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity. And as you've heard, NSABB has been tasked by the government with providing recommendations for the path forward for gain-of-function studies. I think it's absolutely critical that these recommendations be informed by broad input from the community. And so today's seminar, I think, is important, or fora is important for us as we consider our deliberations on this issue. I'm going to talk about 4 things and try and go through them very quickly today. The first is just a brief review of NSABB and what we are and what we've done. The second is the charge to NSABB in this area. I'll go through that in a little more detail. The third, as Harvey said, is a discussion of some of the points that were made at our October meeting and how they may be relevant to your discussion today. And then I'll also reiterate, as Mary did, I think some of the key points where broad input is necessary for the committee. So some of the things we're looking for in your discussions today. So NSABB has been around for a decade. It was founded in 2004. It is a federal advisory committee. We were formed to provide guidance to the U.S. government on the issue of dual-use research, particularly as it pertains to the life sciences. And we've provided recommendations for the oversight of dual-use research and also worked to raise awareness of the dual-use issue, both in the United States and around the world. We consider issues at the request of the United States government, and we provide recommendations to the head of federal entities that have an interest in life sciences research. There are currently 25 voting members of the board. There's very diverse expertise among board members, including areas of science and, of course, the life sciences, biosafety, security, communications, the law, and other areas. Representatives from U.S. government and agencies also serve on the board in a non-voting ex officio capacity. The NSABB has done a lot of work over that decade. It's provided advice to the U.S. government in a number of areas. We have provided a framework for the oversight of life sciences dual-use research, which also includes criteria for identifying the subset of dual-use research that provides the most or the greatest concern. That is dual-use research of concern, which has come to be known as DIRC. We have also developed guidelines for responsibly communicating dual-use research of concern. We provided guidance for developing code of conduct for researchers. Again, PI responsibility has been a critical part of the themes that NSABB has worked under. And we've weighed in on ways to enhance personnel reliability among researchers with access to select agents. We've also worked extensively in the areas of outreach and education. In addition to 2 reports focusing on strategies for raising awareness on the dual-use issue, the board and its members have also participated in a number of meetings for domestic and international outreach. In addition, the board has other duties assigned to it, which includes the occasional review of manuscripts for their dual-use potential, and this was in fact the case for the H1N1 papers that occurred in 2012. And this is a snapshot of the board's report that have been issued over the years. All are freely available at our website. If you simply type in NSABB in your search engine, you'll get directed to this page. So as we've heard from Dr. Hebbeler and Dr. Groesch, the U.S. government has issued a deliberative process to consider the gain-of-function issue. The NSABB is going to be part of that process. This figure provides an overview of the deliberative process as it was described to NSABB in 2014. The goal of this process, as we've heard, is to determine whether certain gain-of-function studies should be conducted, and if so, how they could be conducted safely. Ultimately, the goal is the development of a new U.S. government policy in this area. And in brief, the role of NSABB is to provide recommendations to the U.S. government on a conceptual approach to the evaluation of proposed gain-of-function studies. To inform our deliberations, the government is commissioning formal risk-benefit assessment studies, and NSABB will advise on the design and development of those studies. So they will work with whoever is doing the risk and benefit studies on the design of these studies. In addition, as we've heard, the National Academies play a role by convening the 2 workshops, and you've heard about that already. NSABB met to begin the discussion of gain-of-function issue during its meeting in October. At this meeting, we heard relevant policy updates and formally received our charge from representatives of the U.S. government. We also kicked off an initial discussion of the issue, which included presentation from a broad host of panelists and discussants. One of the sessions focused on the risks, benefits, and ethical considerations associated with gain-of-function studies. A second panel focused on the strength and limitations of biological risk assessments. And I'm going to touch a little on the key themes that were raised at this meeting and then describe the charge that was laid off for the board. Because this issue at hand is so complex and challenging, it's one where content experts, people who are knowledgeable about this issue in many different ways, can have very different opinions on what we should do going forward. I don't think it would be a surprise to anyone that there was a lot of questions raised and a lot of discussion at our meeting in October. As we've heard, 2 weeks before the meeting, the U.S. government had issued its statement calling for a deliberative pause deliberative process, and a funding pause for certain gain-of-function studies. And as such, we heard a very broad discussion of the funding pause. and members of the board expressed some concern, as well as members of the research community, about the scope and implementation of the funding pause. There was also a lot of discussion about the term gain of function. It was pointed out that researchers routinely perform gain of function studies, as well as loss of function studies, but only a small subset of such studies have raised concerns. During the deliberative process, it's going to be very important to focus on the types of gain of function studies that are of greatest concern. There are also concerns about how the pause might be affecting disease surveillance and other activities that are critical to public health. And while the U.S. government statement about the funding pause noted that certain exceptions may be obtained, there were questions about this process. In response to the questions and concerns that we heard, the NSABB drafted a statement to the United States government, which we finalized just this past month, after receiving some clarification from U.S. government officials. The statement commends the U.S. government for undertaking the deliberative process, conveys some of the concerns we heard, and urges some clarifying actions, and that statement, again, is on our website. At our meeting, there was also a discussion of the benefits of gain-of-function studies. This included providing fundamental knowledge about the pathogenicity, transmission, and host range of viruses. We also heard that information from gain-of-function studies may inform surveillance, guide vaccine selection, and aid in the design and development of vaccines and therapeutics. I should note, however, that there was also debate about the benefits associated with these studies. We discussed risks as well, including those associated with biosafety and laboratory containment. There are also dual-use research of concern risks. That is, information from such studies could be misused by individuals seeking to harm public health or national security. I should also note that in addition to the risks associated with conducting certain gain-of-function studies, we also heard that there are potential risks associated with not conducting these studies. We heard concerns about limiting scientific inquiry in certain areas or pausing certain studies, and that could cast a shadow over entire fields, making them less appealing for younger scientists. This could ultimately diminish our scientific capacity in areas that are critical to public health. We had a brief discussion about alternative scientific approaches to gain-of-function studies, and it's going to be useful to further explore this at this meeting to determine if there are safer ways to generate the same or similar scientific knowledge. Finally, we heard presentations from experts in risk assessments who discussed ways to model biological risks. It became clear, at least to me, that risk assessments can provide information to guide decisions, but the assessment alone will not address whether a certain study should or should not be performed. The NSABB was also presented with its charge to advise on the design, development, and conduct of the risk and benefit assessment studies, and to provide recommendations to the United States government on a conceptual approach to the evaluation of proposed gain-of-function studies. And as you heard before, we are tasked with considering the full spectrum of potential risks and benefits associated with such studies, as well as any alternative methods that may be employed to yield similar scientific insights or benefits while reducing potential risks. We also, as we've heard, will consider all of the discussions from the forums hosted by the National Academies and any other additional consultation with relevant subject matter experts as needed. To address the board's initial task of advising on the design of risk and benefit assessments, we have established a working group, and the chairs of the working group, of NSABB working group, are both here today. This group will help to develop the assumptions and inputs that will be part of the risk and benefit studies. And this might include advising on the pathogens or the characteristic pathogens to be modeled in such studies, identifying the type of gain-of-function experiments that are being assessed, identifying any biosafety practices or containment features that may be relevant to the studies, and weighing in on the types of benefits to be assessed and the approaches for assessing them. The working group will present its draft recommendations to the full NSABB board for its endorsement. The final recommendations will guide the risk and benefit assessment studies. As I mentioned previously, we believe our deliberations will benefit from broad public input and both domestic and international dialogues. So therefore, I'm very much looking forward to today's symposium hosted by the National Academies, and I'm hoping they'll shed some light on these very complex issues. In particular, I think our deliberations would benefit from some discussion of the principles that should underpin a risk assessment, the methods for assessing risks, and the types of gain-of-function studies that may be of greatest concern. And of course, we're also very much interested in a deeper exploration of the benefits associated with gain-of-function studies. What benefits should be explored? How should they be assessed? And of course, this may be particularly challenging because science is unpredictable and the benefits may be difficult to predict or to quantify. Finally, we're interested in hearing more about how to weigh the risks and the benefits. Specifically, given that risk and benefit assessment will provide both qualitative and quantitative information, how can we consider this information together? Is there additional expertise that should be sought to help us consider the risks and benefits? Are there additional scientific approaches that we should consider that may have fewer risks and generate similar benefits? With those questions in mind, I'd like to thank the Academies again for inviting me, and I'll rejoin my panelists now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stanley, and thank you all for really excellent overview. We have an opportunity now, in case there are any questions, particularly about the process that we are a part of, the purposes of this meeting, or how it will fit into the overall steps leading to a reassessment and conclusions about the future policy toward gain-of-function research. So if there's any question, if you could go to a microphone and identify yourself, that would be a help. And if you would like to direct it to a particular member of the panel, please do so. Could make sure that that mic is live.
Ron Fouché, Erasmus Medical Center. I have a question for Dr. Hebbeler. So we heard about the role of the NSABB and the National Academies, which is clear, and we all have great confidence that that will go well, given the leadership that they've shown in the past. Has there been any progress on identifying the external partner who will be conducting the risk and benefit analysis? And how is this process going to move forward? Thank you.
I'll actually defer to Mary because NIH is working closely on that particular mechanism.
So we're in the process of identifying a contractor that will conduct the risk and benefit assessments as designed and advised on by the NSABB.
Mary, does that mean it will be a directed contract as opposed to an open RFA, or have you decided that as yet?
I think that it will be, I believe it's going to be an open RFA.
Okay, thank you very much. Please.
Peter Hale, Foundation for Vaccine Research. One question for Dr. Stanley. How does the NSABB intend to go about soliciting broad public input during this process?
So obviously today's symposium or forum is a beginning. Our meetings are, when we have meetings, they're public essentially, so there's always opportunity essentially for public comment and input. So for example, when we begin to look at the first products of the working group, there'll be an opportunity essentially for public comment there as well during our meetings. I think those are some of the things we're looking at. We always solicit comments from the public. Those are given to committee and board members. So, you know, any member of the public essentially can address us through letters and so on, and those are transmitted to the public. So those are some of the ways in which we propose to do it. Mary, do you have other things to add to that?
No, I think you've covered it. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We'll come over here, please.
I'm Johannes Rath from the University of Vienna. I have a question concerning the perimeter of the risk assessment, and the question is it a U.S. national focus or is it a global focus of the risk and benefits? Because I think the risks and the benefits might unfold differently if you look only to the U.S. or globally.
Thank you. I don't know if everyone could hear, but the essence of the question was, will the risk-benefit analysis be U.S.-centric or will it have a broader base of perspective? And Mary, are you prepared to answer that, please?
Yes, we very much want it to have an international perspective to it, so not just U.S.-centric.
Thank you. And one more question.
Nicholas Evans, University of Pennsylvania. This is a question for Professor Stanley. So the NSABB's charge is to articulate a conceptual framework for this risk-benefit analysis, but there will also be, I gather, a private firm or firms conducting the risk-benefit analysis. To what extent will the NSABB's conceptual framework be bounded by what the firm intends to do?
So I think that's a very good question, and I've been through a somewhat similar process in the past. I think we very much, as you say, set the framework, but then we're very involved as data was coming through at a number of incremental spots along the way to make sure that what was coming forward was something we thought would be useful in answering the questions we have. So in other words, we'll be very much engaged, and I don't think we will be bounded by what they do, but rather we will review their input, and if we think there are adjustments necessary, we will adjust the scope accordingly. So I think that this is very much an iterative process when I've gone through it before, and it's very important actually that we have a contractor we can work with, and we will advise and change things as necessary to make sure our deliverable is appropriate.
Let me, on behalf of all of us, thank each of you, Dr. Stanley, Dr. Groesch, Dr. Hebbeler, for being with us. We appreciate your comments, your charge, your guidance, and we will do our best to contribute constructively in the course of this day and a half. Please join me in thanking our speakers.